Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lesson 10 in this Chess Beginner to Winner series, in which we take you from absolute beginner to winning your first chess tournament games and beyond. And today we'll be talking about pins and forks. So, I can't stress enough how important it is to learn all about tactics when you're a beginner, especially a beginner, because most beginner games are lost due to overlooked tactics, and even intermediate, advanced, even chess masters and grandmasters may overlook tactics, just not as much as us normal people, the average chess players. So, if we take a look at, I'll go over a game here and I'll kind of describe pins and forks. So in this game, let's say e4, e5 is played, and then the knight attacks the pawn. The pawn protects, or excuse me, this pawn pushes forward, protecting this pawn, and white just continues development. Developing the bishop here, lining up on this weak f pawn here. And then let's say black decides to push this pawn with the idea of maybe, I don't know, trying to attack the bishop. But he wastes time here. And so this gives white more time to develop another piece. And now we have this move, a pin of this knight to the queen. So a pin is whenever you attack a piece and that piece either cannot move or shouldn't move, because if it does, then you can attack, or excuse me, capture a more valuable piece. So if this knight moves away, the bishop could capture this more valuable queen for the less valuable bishop. So there are two types of pins. I believe they are relative pins and absolute pins. A relative pin is when you pin the piece to the piece behind it, but that piece can still move. And an absolute pin involves, let's say, the king, a piece being pinned to the king. Well, then it is illegal to move that piece because you would put yourself in check. And of course, that's not allowed in chess. So if we continue on here, whenever your piece is pinned, like this knight here, you could push a pawn forward, attacking the pinning piece and forcing them to make a decision. So, you could move here, and then they have to decide whether to capture, and then you could recapture, or do they back up and keep the pin? But then that could allow you to push the pawn forward and break the pin, and then they would have to retreat. But in this game, something interesting happened. If we go back through these moves, once we get to this point of the bishop pinning the knight to the queen, you think, well, I can't move that knight or I'll lose my queen. But in fact, in the game, this move was played. The knight jumps up to e5 here, allowing the bishop to capture the queen. And you think, okay, well, if he captures that queen, which is what happened in the game, so black jumps ahead in material, capturing, thinking that, well, now he's attacking a pawn. Either the knight will come back and capture, that way the king can still castle, or the king would capture and be stuck in the center. But the game continued in a different way, because now, if we take a look at white's material, we see that white has 3 pieces developed and black only has 1 here. So this lead in piece development gives white a great advantage. And if you can see the analysis here by the computer, There is, in fact, the possibility of a mate in 2. But since we're talking about pins and forks, there's also the possibility of the knight capturing here on f7, forking the queen and the rook. But if white does that, if white were to capture this pawn on f7 with the knight and it would be protected by the bishop, well, the queen could move and the knight could capture this rook, but with black having the extra queen, he would be ahead in this game and would probably go on to win. So white instead starts attacking the king with a check here, capturing this weak f-pawn, and that's something you always have to keep an eye out for in your own games, is the weak f-pawn, because if your opponent piles up pieces on that f-pawn, it can cause problems. And now where does the king go? The knight is cutting off this square on d7, and so the king is forced forward. And now the other knight jumps in here, delivering a checkmate. And so the king has been trapped in the center of the board. Now, black could have avoided all this after e4, e5, knight to f3, d6, protecting the pawn. Bishop develops, and then this wasted move here. Instead, it probably would have been better to go ahead and, I don't know, either, well, let's see what the computer recommends. It actually recommends d4 here, attacking. You would give up your pawn, possibly. So if d4 was played, white would capture that pawn. But in the game, white just keeps developing. And then with this pin, once white made this move, capturing a pawn, it looks like the best move would be just to capture that knight, but that would allow the queen to capture, and white would be ahead that extra pawn, and he would have an advantage going into the middle game here. So, that is how black could have avoided that checkmate. All right, so back to pins and forks. Let's go to the basics here. I will set up a few positions and we'll see how the pins and the forks work. All right, so many pieces can perform a pin, but usually you would have, maybe, let's see, I'll just go ahead and put all the pieces back on the board. So this is probably what you're familiar with the most. Let's say we start with this opening right here, which is called the French defense. Let's say he goes here. And now if we have something like this. So the knight jumps up here to put more pressure on this pawn. And white could go ahead and play this move. So you're probably familiar with this. This is the classic pin with the bishop, pinning the knight to the queen. And you don't want to move this knight, or you just capture the queen, unless you have a tricky checkmate opportunity like that last game that we looked at. So normally bishop to e7 would be played here, breaking that pin and allowing the knight to move away. And there's also the threat of pushing this pawn forward. So perhaps instead of going here to e7, black is not aware of what's going on and pushes here to d6. So now we have black definitely has problems here. So the best move would be to play e5. So a lot of times when you have a pin, the way to take advantage of that pin is to add another attacker to the pinned piece. And so this pawn jumps forward attacking this knight. And so the knight can't move or the queen is captured. But now we're also forking. The pawn is forking the bishop and the knight here. So this is a interesting little example of a pin and a fork at the same time here. So now it looks like the best move would be knight at b to d7. So, pretty interesting. We'll just play out what the computer says is best. Also, just moving back here, bishop to e7, but then the knight is going to be captured. So, maybe this would be played, counterattacking the bishop here. Well, then it looks like capture would be better, an even capture here. And then the pawn could recapture. But now we still have the pawn capturing the bishop here. And so after capturing towards the center, recommended by the computer, now we have queen to f3 recommended, and white is ready to castle queenside and try and press forward and get some attack going on the king side against the king, especially if the king castles over here and these pawns are broken apart. So that's just a little example of how pins and forks can work. Now I'll break it down to the most basics of pins and forks. So let me set up a position. We'll clear the board. All right. So let's say you have a king on the board here, and, I don't know, a knight is here, and this bishop is pinning the knight. And then maybe white has a pawn here that's under attack by this knight. Well, now if it's white's turn, he has this threat of pushing the pawn. So we just push this pawn, and now the knight cannot move because the bishop is pinning the knight to the king, an absolute pin. So the king would probably have to move. Maybe comes forward to attack the pawn, but it's too late because now either the pawn could capture or the bishop, and now the bishop is protecting the pawn, and the king can't even capture the pawn. So that was an example of how a pin can be used, and then you add more pressure and capture the pinned piece. Now, we've seen how bishops can pin, but there are other possibilities as well. So if we put this piece here, and let's see, we'll get rid of this bishop and pawn. So let's say we could use a knight again. Maybe there's a knight out here in the center of the board. And once again, we have a pawn here, maybe, and a pawn here. So the knight jumps out and attempts to fork both of these pawns. He's forking the pawns, attacking them both at the same time. And that's what a fork is as well, since we're talking about pins and forks. A fork is basically when one piece is attacking more than one opponent's piece. So a knight could be, we could have all kinds of pawns on the board or pieces. Let's say, excuse me. We could have a pawn here and a pawn here. And so this knight could be forking all these pawns. He's attacking all the pawns at the same time. But if white has a rook available that can swing over and pin the knight to the king. So now this knight is not allowed to move because the king would end up being in check, and of course that's illegal. So maybe the king rushes forward to try and protect the knight, but it's too late. The pawn jumps forward here, attacking, and now if the king tries to jump up here, it's already too late. Either the pawn or the rook could capture. If the rook captures, he would be protected. And he could also just capture with the pawn. And this move is not bad either because the pawn is covering this f6 and d6 square. And so the king can't even move over to attack these pawns. So he would have to back up. And of course, now there are 3 pawns on the loose. If he goes over here, well, then this pawn would march forward and promote. But that's an extreme example. But something to remember is whenever you have a king stuck in the middle of the board and there's a possibility of a rook to jump or a queen, a long distance piece that can jump to the center of the board and attack that king, always be careful about putting one of your pieces on the same line as your king. And even if these pawns weren't here, and maybe we had this pawn here, well, even in this case, you could have something like this, pinning. The pawn could try and protect the knight, but once again, one of the pawns can jump forward, and if the king tries to come down in the game, well, then you capture, and then recapture. So another example of how to use a pin to your advantage. All right. I think you get the idea on pins. Just one way you can improve with pins and forks is to look over a bunch of tactical problems or puzzles involving pins and forks and any other tactics, because the more tactics you see and study, the more familiar you'll become with these tactics and be able to use them more often in your games and also defend against them. And so just remember, learning tactics are very important to your improvement in chess. All right, let's clear the board and let's see what else we can take a look at for pins and forks. Okay, clear off the board. And okay, we've seen how the bishop is able to pin. A lot of times the bishop will just pin a knight to the king, or even on the other side, to the queen. Also, be careful of lining pieces up on your king, because a rook could shoot over and pin that piece to your king. And so now we could take a look at some forks as well. One of the most common types of forks would be, let's see, if black has some setup, a normal setup, and his king is maybe in the center. And you've probably seen this type of fork many times before. Put a rook here and a queen over here. So you've probably seen this often where, let's see, we can just put another pawn there so the queen cannot capture. Let's say the knight is up here, and at this point, black is not aware of the coming possibility here of a fork, and so just attacks the knight, trying to drive it away, and overlooks the possibility of attacking once again the weak f pawn, and the bishop backs the knight up, and so the knight is attacking the rook and the queen at the same time. And so, the queen will move in this position if the bishop is not protected. We could have something like this, capturing. The knight could continue to capture, and at least here the queen could recapture this piece, and then maybe the knight could escape out here. So this is just one possibility, but be careful and just do a little double checking, because if white moved some other piece, elsewhere on the board, and excuse me, move that back up there where it was, and if the queen was able to jump back up here, well, now there's a possibility of the knight being trapped because the queen is cutting off its retreat here as well as the king, and the queen also cuts off this escape square. So then maybe the king could march over here and pick off this knight. So, all the more reason to practice problems with pins and forks, because there could be little alternate variations that you haven't seen before. And the more you practice with pins and forks, the more familiar you'll be with the possible combinations and different tactics available to you, or that your opponent might try to use against you. And so just remember, almost any piece can pin. Let's see here. If we have a pawn, and let's say, let me get rid of, well, we can put that there. Let's say the queen has jumped out here to the center of the board, and beside the queen could even be the king. Let me bear with me here. So for whatever reason, you can ignore these other pieces up here, but say the king and the queen are out in the center of the board and they overlook this simple move here. Now the lowly pawn is attacking the king with check, and the queen is under attack at the same time. So whenever your king is in check, you have, of course, one of three things you can do. Block the attacker, which is not possible because they're side by side here. Run, or capture. So if you're going to lose the queen anyway after the king retreats, the queen might as well take some pieces down with her. So capture, then the other pawn recaptures and the king captures. So at least you got two pawns with that queen when you lost her. So that is just an example of how powerful lowly pawns can be when they're attacking more valuable pieces. And then, of course, the knight, we've already seen how the knight can fork many pieces. So let's say, I don't know, the knight is here and the queen is, up here somewhere. And then we have a rook over here. Well, now we see that this knight can jump up here, forking the queen, the king with check, and the rook. And so what would be best? Well, the king has to move away. But what if the king moved away by going up here? Well, now the best move would be to capture the queen. And now you're checking the king, giving you time to run away. And also, if there was another rook up here, the knight would be able to continue on and attack another piece. So always be aware, especially with the knights, when you attack, capture a piece, and you're able to check the king. So once the queen was captured, putting the king in check, always watch where you move your king, because if the knight is able to move and check the king again and then capture another piece somewhere, the fork just continues on and gives you a lot of problems. All right, so we've gone over how the knight can fork, how the pawns can fork. We might as well take a look at the other pieces. Let's see, we'll remove this. How about a bishop? Well, let's see here. Let's say there's a bishop here. And let me think of where a good example would be. Oh, get rid of that. All right, let's say the black king is trying to move down, or for whatever reason, the king is here, and he leaves a rook all the way up here on the other side of the board. So this is something you have to watch out for with bishops, because their strength is in their long distance attacking power. So the bishop could move up here, of course. And now we have a fork by this bishop attacking the king and the rook. And of course, the king would have to move. And then you swoop in over here and capture the bishop, or excuse me, use the bishop to capture the rook. All right. So that is just one example. Also, the bishop could excel at picking off pawns. If you had a bishop over here, and let's see. Anyway, you get the idea. If you can move your bishop somewhere where it attacks multiple pawns or pieces and try and use that to your advantage, you could try and just start picking off these pawns or whatever pieces you're forking with the bishop. So just keep that in mind. The long distance power of the bishop makes it very dangerous in open positions, whereas the knight can be stronger when the position is blocked and the bishops don't have much room to move. The knights can jump over pieces and fork other pieces. So we'll take a quick look at the rooks. So, of course, here the rook is forking both of these pawns and the king as well. So we have a check. Let's say the king moves up here. Oh, excuse me. The king tries to move up toward the pawn, but he can't protect it in time. Now there's another check and a fork of the king and the other pawn. So the king moves attacking, but now the rook picks off the other pawn. So rooks can be very dangerous in the end game when the board is kind of open, and they can swoop in there and start forking pieces and pawns and just mowing down the opponent's pawns especially. And that's another reason why it's usually a good idea to get your rook on your opponent's 7th rank. Because let's say they've castled and you move up here, and they usually have pawns lined up over here. So in this position, if they had a rook, they could just move over here with their rook and protect this unprotected pawn. But let's say I don't know, this was over here, and the king, for whatever reason, ran down to the corner here because he was under attack earlier. Well, now if the rook gets up here, well, what do? Black is having problems here with both pawns being attacked. So maybe he can save one of them, but the other one can get picked off. And now the king can drive that rook out, but the rook has already done some damage by capturing a pawn. So we see how one rook is important on the 7th rank and can fork different pawns. And if you get 2 rooks up there, it'll be even more dangerous. And perhaps I will go over that part of chess strategy in another lesson. But for now, let's move on to the queen, the forking power of the queen. So here, if it's white's turn to move, he has different options. He could, well, choose multiple ways to fork here. He could move queen to g2, attacking the king, and also this pawn over here on b7. He could also try something like this, queen to c2, forking the king and this pawn. Now the king would be able to move. Maybe the king would move up here, thinking about hiding in this hole back here behind some pawn cover. But now we have the queen capturing a pawn and attacking the rook. And the rook is protecting this pawn. So now the queen is also forking the rook and another pawn. And if the king went to protect the rook, well, now the queen could just pick off another piece here. And you get the idea. The queen is very dangerous. So you could put the queen in the middle and it could attack so many pieces. We'll just put pawns out there for an example. So in this position, yes, the queen can just attack all these pawns at the same time. So it's pretty crazy, the massive attacking power that the queen has. So just remember that when you're looking for forks, especially in the end game in a wide open position with the queen, she can cause a lot of damage. All right. Well, you get the idea. Pins, forks, very important tactics to learn. So always keep an eye out for any pins and forks, and hopefully you can use them in your own games and use them to your advantage, and also prevent your opponent from sneaking in any pins and forks that surprise you. All right, well, I hope this lesson has helped you some, and continue the lessons as I slowly increase the knowledge level and the difficulty as well. We'll keep things pretty easy here for a while for you beginners out there, but we'll slowly add more information that's important to know. All right, thank you everybody. If you hung around for the entire video, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. You can leave comments or suggestions, leave any video requests, and I'll try to get to those when I can. So have a super chess day, everyone. Thank you.